Eclipse season is back, and this month we're getting two of them. A total lunar eclipse turning the moon a haunting blood red, and just 2 weeks later, a partial solar eclipse, and if that weren't enough, the Milky Way is making its grand return just in time for the March Equinox. Welcome back to Orbit Insights. I'm Nathan Prather. There are two major celestial events coming up this month, so let's discuss them. Before we get into it, please subscribe if you are new to the channel. I think in general, most people really like the moon, and I also think that in general, most people probably like photography. Well, if you do, you're in for a treat this month. We have a total lunar eclipse on March 13th through March 14th, which also just happens to be Pi Day. So on the night of March 13th into the early hours of March 14th, we'll get to see a full-blown moon and a total lunar eclipse. Now, this is the first total lunar eclipse of 2025, and during the peak called totality, the moon is going to turn this deep reddish color. And that's why people call it a blood moon. So, obviously it's not actually blood, but it's a really stunning sight, and you're not going to want to miss it. So what's really going on? So when a total lunar eclipse happens, what essentially is going on is the sun, the earth, and the moon are lined up perfectly in a straight line. And the sun doing what it always does best, shining its light across space, just like a kind of giant spotlight. And then the earth is right in the middle, blocking some of that sunlight, which creates a really big shadow out in space. So the moon, which moves right into the shadow, which is what we call the eclipse. But what's really cool is that instead of turning completely dark, the moon turns this beautiful reddish-orange color. And the reason for that is because some of the sun's light bends across the edges of Earth through its atmosphere. So the blue light gets scattered away, which is why, our sky is blue, because all that blue light is reflected during the day, but the red light passes through and hits the moon. This does make the moon glow red and orange, just like what you would see during a sunrise or a sunset, but to a much greater degree. And that's why we call it a blood moon. So there are three different phases of a lunar eclipse. So the penumbral phase, which is when the moon enters into the outer edge of Earth's shadow, and it looks a little bit dimmer. It's pretty easy to miss if you're not paying attention, if you don't know that there is or is going to be a lunar eclipse. And then we have the partial phase, and that's when you'll see a dark curve slowly covering the moon. And then we have totality, and this is the main event that everybody loves seeing, where the moon is totally covered by Earth's shadow, and it turns this eerie reddish color, which we talked about earlier. It lasts about an hour usually. So who's going to have the best view? Well, the total lunar eclipse will be visible from a lot of different places on Earth and different phases, and of course as well. So, for example, North and South America, you'll be able to see the full show starting late on March 13th and continuing into the early hours of March 14th. So if you're on the east coast of the US, the eclipse is going to begin at 11:57 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on March 13th, and it's going to reach totality at 2:26 a.m. Eastern Time on March 14th, ending at 3:31 a.m. Eastern Time. If you're on the western parts of Europe and Africa, you can catch the eclipse in the early morning hours of March 14th, with totality happening just before sunrise. Now, even if you're outside of these areas, you still might be able to catch a partial eclipse or the penumbral phase Now, I would recommend checking out timeanddate.com to see what parts of the lunar eclipse that you can see from your exact location and the timing. You can also check out Sky Safari or Stellarium, which are planetary apps that you can download to your phone or to your desktop. And then, of course, NASA's Eclipse website, which is going to be another great resource to check out. I'm going to do a full recap video that should go up on Sunday about the eclipse, so I'm going to be viewing it. I'll tell you my thoughts on it. And I will have also all these resources, time and date, Stellarium, Sky Safari, and NASA, linked in the description box down below, so you can learn everything from those sources as well. I would also suggest, if you can, trying to photograph the eclipse. So if you're wanting to photograph this eclipse, I would really recommend doing it. Obviously, especially if you have clear skies. Even if you don't have completely clear skies, as long as you can see something, it's a really cool event to view and definitely try to photograph. So, for instance, this is a picture that I took of the total lunar eclipse back in November of 2022. There were a lot of clouds, so I would just try your best if you can, but you can use any camera, smartphone, DSLR, anything like that you have. Obviously, just have the moon in frame and have it at a moderate zoom. You can use a lens of 300 millimeters for the camera, and if you have a full frame, then you can use something like around 450 millimeters. And you're also going to need a tripod, more than likely, at least to stabilize your shots, and also because the Earth is rotating, the moon is moving, all of that. You're also going to want to adjust your shutter speed. That's going to be really important, especially if you're not using a star tracker. Now, before the eclipse, when the moon is fully bright, here are some settings to use. Now, around 50 to 75% of the partial eclipse, you're going to want to up your ISO. Now, during totality, it's going to become very, very dim. You're going to want to up your ISO significantly. Now, you're going to get more noise with higher ISO settings, but it's kind of a trade-off. And then as the moon goes through its partial phase, again, as well as the penumbral phase, just follow the steps from before. You can also do a time-lapse, but time-lapses are also pretty tricky, so I wouldn't necessarily suggest it, especially if you haven't done it before. Try it first on something less complicated. So now that's the total lunar eclipse on March 13th and 14th. Now on March 29th, we have a new moon, which coincides with a partial solar eclipse. Now a partial solar eclipse happens when the moon passes between the Earth and the Sun, but doesn't necessarily line up perfectly. So only a portion of the Sun is going to be covered by the moon's shadow. So this kind of results in what looks like the Sun getting a big chunk taken out of it, almost kind of like the cosmic cookie, if you will. When it comes to a partial solar eclipse or anything other than a total solar eclipse, the total solar eclipse's totality phase, you can't look at the Sun directly without proper eye protection. So if you're going to be photographing this event, you have to have a solar filter for your camera lens or your telescope. So who's going to be lucky enough to see the partial solar eclipse? So it's going to be visible from parts of northern Canada, Greenland, and the Arctic parts of Europe, including parts of Russia. But again, to check the visibility of your location, check out timeanddate.com. You can check out NASA, use the Sky Safari and Stellarium apps. All of those resources will be linked in the description box down below. Now, if you're trying to photograph this event, make sure that you use a solar filter, as I said, and just like with photographing the moon, you can use something around 300 millimeters or longer for detailed shots. You might want to try out ISO 100 with an aperture of f8 to f16 for sharpness, and then the shutter speed is going to kind of depend on your exact conditions, but I would recommend just bracketing, kind of like with the total lunar eclipse. So otherwise, I would definitely recommend trying out a time-lapse so that you can create a really beautiful sequence showing the progression of the eclipse. Now, twice a year, something happens that's really extraordinary where the sun rises due east and it sets due west, and this is called the equinox. But for this time of year, it's called the March Equinox, and it's an astronomical event that marks the beginning of spring in the northern hemisphere and autumn in the southern hemisphere. But what exactly is the March Equinox? Well, it occurs when the sun is directly above the Earth's equator, illuminating both hemispheres equally. So this perfect balance results in nearly equal night and day across the globe, and it's a reminder of the planet's delicate dance with the sun. Now, throughout history, cultures around the world have paid homage to this celestial event. For example, in Mexico, the Pyramid of El Castillo at Chichen casts a shadow that resembles a serpent slithering down its steps. Today, the March Equinox continues to inspire celebrations. In Japan, it signals the blooming of cherry blossoms. Now, you may have noticed that the sky is changing a little bit up there during the night. So every spring, from around late February to early March, the Milky Way begins its grand reappearance in the northern hemisphere, where it starts as this really faint glow in the eastern horizon just before dawn. It's going to gradually rise higher, becoming more visible as the nights grow shorter. And by midsummer, it's going to dominate the southern sky. So if you are a deep space imager in the northern hemisphere, then March kind of signals the start of galaxy season. So during this time of year, the Earth's nighttime side faces away from the dense plane of the Milky Way. Instead of peering through clouds of dust and gas, we kind of get this clearer view of the vast cosmos and beyond. Specifically around 9 o'clock and later into the early morning. So if you're in the northern hemisphere, I would really recommend starting off with the Leo triplet, which is going to be a great target if you are looking for a wide field kind of composition. And it contains 3 visible galaxies. Now, for some deep field imaging in the northern hemisphere, anywhere between 500 millimeters and up to 2,000 millimeters of focal length, I would recommend the Whirlpool Galaxy or the Headphone Nebula, which is a really cool planetary nebula. Now, if you're in the southern hemisphere and it's not really galaxy season, well, you can still check out the Large Magellanic Cloud, or LMC for short. And this one is cool because you can image it with a lot of different focal lengths, from very wide to very deep. And then we also have the Fighting Dragons of NGC 6188, which is an absolutely stunning area of the night sky, and this is going to be perfect for narrowband filters such as hydrogen alpha and O3, or creating a really cool image where S2 or sulfur 2 is in the red channel, hydrogen alpha or HA is the green channel, and O3 or oxygen 3 is the blue channel. Now, this is called the hue palette, and it's very popular when it comes to photographing galaxies. they are considered broadband targets, so you'd be photographing light from across the visible light spectrum, which means that it's important to photograph it in the darkest possible conditions. So less light pollution, so go somewhere away from the city lights to try to image this. It's especially good during a new moon, which again is going to be on the 29th with that partial solar eclipse. But if you're going to be in a light polluted area, you can just kind of use your traditional light pollution filter. Now, next month we have one of the best meteor showers of the year happening, which is going to be a really cool sight, so subscribe if you want to hear more about that. And so share your thoughts down below. Do you plan on viewing either of these events? What are your thoughts? Have you viewed these types of events before? I would love to hear all of your thoughts down below. Subscribe today, and of course, as always, you can check out some more videos right now.